In June 2003, 4 bodies surfaced in a quiet Japanese bay. No one expected who the killers would turn out to be, or how trivial and senseless their motives were. What unfolded was a case of shocking brutality by a group of men, completely overtaken by an extreme level of greed. This is the story of the Matsumoto family massacre. Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. If you watch my videos, please consider subscribing. It really helps out the channel. I'd also appreciate if you leave a comment and like this video. Now, let's lift the thin veil. At about 6 in the morning of the 20th of June 2003, Shinjiro Matsumoto's father knocked on the door of his son's home in Fukuoka, Japan, where he lived with his wife, Chika Matsumoto, and their son, who was 11, and a daughter who was 6. Grandfather Matsumoto had arrived to pick up his grandchildren and take them to school as he usually did. But this time, after ringing the bell, nobody opened the door. Out of respect for the family's privacy, the grandfather decided to wait outside. After about an hour, he started to get worried. Crime was almost non-existent in Hakata Bay, the ward in the city of Fukuoka where they lived, and it was unlike the family to keep their door closed. Usually they'd be in the kitchen, starting off their day, door wide open for friends and family to enter as they pleased. Grandfather Matsumoto decided to yell to announce his presence, but again, there was no response, so he finally decided to go in. His grandchildren were due at school, after all. Grandfather Matsumoto went from room to room looking for his grandchildren, but he couldn't find a trace of anyone. The apartment was completely empty. Then he realized he could smell something metallic in the air. He looked for the source but found nothing. That's until he stood in front of the bathroom door. The light was on, and he knocked first in case anyone was inside. He waited for about 10 minutes before deciding to enter. As he walked in, what he saw would stay with him for the rest of his life. The bathroom was covered in blood. It stained the walls, floor, and bathtub. In a state of panic, he rushed to the master bedroom and noticed the balled-up sheets, crinkled like they had been ripped off the bed, and there was more blood on the carpet. In a state of confusion, Grandfather Matsumoto called his son's work. Shinjiro Matsumoto was not there, but even if he had been, where were Chika and the children? The grandfather knew it was time to call the police, and a little while later, the apartment was swarming with forensic investigators conducting DNA tests. Blood of the entire family was found, but also of other individuals who were not related to the Matsumoto family. It was quickly concluded that the family had either been killed or severely injured. That same evening, June the 20th, around 6 p.m., a worker at a nearby lumber yard spotted a human leg floating in a body of water known as the Hakozaki Pier and alerted the police. Officers quickly arrived with a team of divers, and it didn't take long before all 4 of the Matsumoto family members were pulled from the bay. They were bound together with iron chains, each body weighed down by heavy dumbbells. This puzzled everyone who knew the family. They didn't have any enemies. Why would anyone want to harm them? And most importantly, who? Shinjiro Matsumoto had a roller coaster of a career. He was born in Fukuoka City in 1962. After dropping out of high school, he then moved to Tokyo, where he trained at a restaurant in an upscale district. By 1988, he was back in Fukuoka, running his own Korean restaurant, which quickly became a local hotspot. Celebrities dined there, and it was even featured on TV. Business was good, and he later opened a second restaurant. His wife, Chika, was also from Fukuoka. The two had been together since high school and married in 1990. After they had children, for a while, life seemed stable, but that changed in 2001 when the mad cow disease scare forced both restaurants to shut down, driving them in debt. Struggling financially, Shinjiro partnered with a relative to start a business retailing women's clothing, but the venture failed, leaving him in further debt, almost 40 million yen, roughly worth $600,000 today. Part of their debt was from buying a high-end Mercedes. This car plays a pivotal role later in the case. Early on, investigators suspected the loan company might have been involved in the family's disappearance, but that theory didn't hold up for long. When questioned, the company rep confirmed Shinjiro's loan was still active, but not yet in default. There hadn't been any debt collector sent out, ruling them out as suspects, so the detectives turned to the bodies for clues. Forensic analysis revealed grim details about the family's final moments. Both of Shinjiro's children had deep bruises on their necks, clear signs of strangulation. The autopsy results for Chika were especially disturbing. She had been violated violently before her death, with clear DNA evidence showing that several men had been involved. Over 30 patches of skin were missing from her body. One large open wound on her abdomen was likely the cause of death, suggesting she'd suffered immensely in her final moments. Shinjiro was also found with multiple injuries, bruises on his back and face, cuts and scars all over his body, and a fractured skull from heavy blows to the head. But despite the severity of these wounds, the cause of death wasn't blunt force trauma. He had drowned. The evidence showed that Shinjiro was still alive when he was dumped into the sea, beaten, chained, and left to die underwater. Investigators used the iron chains and dumbbells as leads and hoped the murder weapons themselves might point to whoever was behind the killings. And when the police began their search, the areas around the Matsumoto family home proved to be the most helpful. The following day, on the 21st of June 2003, a hardware store in the neighborhood was found to stock the same dumbbells and iron chains that were found on the brutalized family. The police also discovered that the store had only recently sold these items to 3 men, who the staff claimed were relatively young and Chinese. The store's surveillance system showed 2 men entering the store, one wearing a peaked cap, the other in a mask to purchase all 3 items. Meanwhile, street cameras outside the store caught a third individual waiting just outside. In the early 2000s, Japan was a popular destination for foreign students, especially from nearby Asian countries. The cost of education was relatively affordable, the admission process less competitive than in the West, and for students from neighboring nations, the cultural overlap made settling in a little easier. It wasn't uncommon to see young Chinese students blending into campus life, studying, working part-time jobs, and experiencing life abroad. For most, it was a simple path: earn a degree, then return home to start a future. But not everyone stayed on that path. Among those who strayed from it were Wang Liang, Yang Ning, and Wei Wei, 3 Chinese nationals enrolled at various universities in Fukuoka. They were the ones caught on camera that night buying the items used to restrain and weigh down the Matsumoto family. Before we get into how they were identified, let's take a look at who they were and how they ended up at the hardware store next to the Matsumoto family home. All 3 men were in their 20s, and Wang Liang and Yang Ning had known each other since childhood. Both were from China's Jilin province, and whilst Wang came from a relatively well-off family, Yang Ning's background was more modest. They arrived in Fukuoka about a year apart, but by April 2003, they were living together in a small apartment, paying just 20,000 yen a month, worth around $290 today. Yang Ning worked multiple part-time jobs, juggling shifts at a fast food joint, and also delivering newspapers, which will be relevant later. Wang Liang, on the other hand, was burning through his parents' money on nightlife at expensive bars and restaurants, and having trouble at university. Eventually, his parents cut off his funds. After a string of skipped classes and campus fights, he was expelled. With his student visa voided, Wang chose to stay in Japan illegally, now completely broke and on the edge. Yang Ning wasn't doing much better. He'd developed an undisclosed health condition that made it hard to keep up with both work and school. His grades were slipping, and he was having trouble keeping up with the university fees. Wei Wei came into the picture a little later in 2003. He was also from a wealthy family and was a sharp student with outstanding grades. He had earned a scholarship to study abroad and enrolled in a computer engineering course at a different university in Fukuoka. On the surface, he seemed stable. He even had a long-term girlfriend, but Wei Wei found that he struggled with the language barrier. His poor Japanese skills made lectures and assignments frustrating, and over time, he started skipping class altogether. His grades tanked, and because he couldn't make any friends due to the language barrier, his mood darkened. Wei Wei did not face any financial difficulties, but with his academic failures weighing heavily on him, he began to believe there was no future for him through honest means. So at some point, soon after arriving in Japan, he decided to cross the line. His first known attempt at making money involved exploiting fellow students specifically targeting young women and arranging for them to meet older men. Whether this was done through manipulation, coercion, or force isn't fully clear, but Wei Wei kept all the earnings for himself. The operation didn't last long, and it's unknown why he abandoned it, but it clearly didn't go as planned. So a few days later, he broke into a fellow student's house, assaulted him, and stole about 260,000 yen, which is worth about $3,600 today. Most likely trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy, Wei Wei continued to attend some of his computer engineering classes while developing his taste for crime. To keep up with the assignments, he often visited a local internet cafe. That's where he met Wang and Yang. What started as a casual conversation over shared frustrations turned into a close bond between the three. Wang and Yang helped Wei Wei with his Japanese, and the trio began confiding in each other, mostly about money, stress, and how trapped they felt. By April 2003, the three weren't just friends, they had become each other's safety net, one built on desperation, resentment, and the quiet pressure of survival. And because of that desperation, especially for money and acceptance, the trio had decided that they needed to make money and make it fast. Yang Ning, who was living in Japan illegally, knew he needed to return home, but he couldn't go back empty-handed. The pressure to bring something back to his family weighed heavily on him. He shared his thoughts with Wang Liang, who also wanted to return to China, and the two quickly agreed. They needed a fortune to make their families proud. But they knew the risks. Stealing alone would be too dangerous, so they needed a plan. After some thought, they decided that Wei Wei would be the perfect third partner. He had done it before and gotten away with theft, and that would give them the confidence they needed. His involvement would give them the strength and numbers and knowledge they needed to pull off something bigger. With Wei Wei on board, they formed an unspoken pact to get whatever they wanted by any means necessary. No rules, no limits. Over the next few weeks, the trio began working together on a string of robberies that grew increasingly bold and violent. In May 2003, Wei Wei posed as a senior student at the Japanese language school they all attended. Using this cover, they visited the apartment of two younger Chinese students, rumored to be holding large amounts of cash. When the door opened, Wang Liang and Yang Ning stormed in, knives in hand, and held the students hostage until they handed over their money and jewelry. Just a few days after that, they escalated again, this time breaking into the school itself. They stole about 70,000 yen, which is just over $1,000 in today's money, barely enough to keep them afloat for a month even. But the trio wasn't interested in small payouts. They wanted more, and fast. They briefly tried to revive Wei Wei's pimping enterprise, but again, it failed. At one point, while attempting to rob cash, they ended up stealing another student's ID, which they used to forge documents and buy mobile phones. This would prove useful for them as they could stay in contact. In 2003, phones weren't as common as they are now, so this move gave them a strategic edge. Still, their ambitions were growing faster than their profits, and this is where Yang Ning's jobs came into play. During his shifts in the ramen restaurant, Yang Ning initially brought up the idea of robbing the restaurant owner, who had a respectable amount of wealth, but after he thought it through, Yang decided it was too risky, and there was a high chance they'd get caught. While they came up with a plan, Yang continued his newspaper route, and one day, he noticed he passed by what's called a mansion. Parked outside that mansion was a brand new Mercedes-Benz C200. In Japan, a mansion is not what you might be thinking. It's usually a luxurious building that is at least 3 stories high. However, the residents shared that building with many others, sort of like high-quality low-rise apartments in the US. But it was this mansion that eventually became a part of their plan. When Yang eventually told Wei Wei and Wang, the decision was unanimous. Despite not knowing anything about the people who lived there, they would rob the place and leave no witnesses behind, simply because they considered the Mercedes C200 a car only a wealthy person could buy. Initially, they had planned to bury the bodies on a mountain nearby, but decided that would take too much time. Instead, they decided to dump the corpses in a body of water nearby, Hakozaki Pier in the Hakata Bay, but for that, they'd need equipment. So on June the 17th, 2003, the trio headed to a hardware store to purchase dumbbells, iron chains, handcuffs, and daggers. On a side note, I find it extremely weird that staff at the store didn't find it highly suspicious that these items were being purchased altogether. They staked out the house for a few days, discovering the schedules and identities of the people inside. Among them, 41-year-old Shinjiro, his wife Chika, and son and daughter. On the night of June the 19th, 2003, at around 11 p.m., the Matsumoto family's peaceful evening turned into a nightmare. Yang, Wang, and Weiwei slipped through the prayer window of the family home. Their home, once safe and quiet, was going to become a trap. The men had initially planned to wait for Shinjiro to return home, but when they saw an open window, they decided to strike. Chika and her children were unaware of the danger closing in. Chika was upstairs, preparing for a bath, while her son and daughter slept soundly in their rooms. Yang and Weiwei immediately went after Chika. They barged into the bathroom where she screamed and threw a bucket at them in a desperate attempt to defend herself. But it was no use. Weiwei forced her head under water while Yang held her arms down. While they did this, they took the opportunity to force themselves on her. After 10 minutes, Chika was drowned, her lifeless body left in the tub. Upstairs, Wang stood guard by the children's rooms. The men next set their sights on the son. They smothered him with a pillow, and although he fought back, Wang strangled the boy, with the attack leaving bruises all over his body. They then moved to the daughter, still in bed. They carried her with tape over her mouth and her arms bound into the living room, where Yang began to interrogate her about where the family kept their money, but the terrified little girl could barely respond. After viciously murdering Chika and her son, the men waited for Shinjiro to return home. At 1:40 in the morning, he pulled into the driveway, unaware of the horrors that awaited him. As soon as he entered the house, he was confronted by Yang, who demanded he sit. Seeing his daughter held hostage, Shinjiro begged for his life, offering to comply with anything they asked. The men handcuffed him, and after forcing him to give up his bank card details, they bound him and attempted to strangle him with the necktie he was wearing. But he wasn't an easy target. The three men worked together, pulling the tie as hard as they could to kill him, and they thought they had succeeded, but Shinjiro was still clinging to life. Believing he was gone, they turned on his daughter and strangled her with Shinjiro's necktie. Then they began the process of disposing their bodies. They loaded the parents and children into the family's Mercedes-Benz. Their plan was clear: dump the corpses in the sea. They made their way to Hakazaki Pier, where they attached weights to the bodies and then disposed of them there. After all was said and done, at around 5 a.m., at the cost of 4 innocent lives, the robbers had gained a grand total of approximately $2,500. They couldn't do anything with the Mercedes, as car sales leave a paper trail, so they abandoned it on a quiet street after disposing of some of the blood-stained evidence inside. The men thought that they had gotten away with it, but their plan fell apart faster than they had anticipated. It was actually just a few hours after the murderers had left the pier that a construction worker noticed a floating human leg and called the police. By the evening of June the 20th, the police were all over the crime scene, and the investigation was underway. They had already seen the trio buying dumbbells in the surveillance footage from the hardware store. Within hours, portraits of the three suspects were released to the public, and investigators began questioning anyone who might have information. When the men saw that a public request for information had been put out, in a panic, Yang Ning and Wang Liang took the first flight out of Japan, borrowing money from a friend to escape. They had arranged this part of the plan a few days before they invaded the Matsumoto family home. They landed in China and over time assumed false identities and finding jobs in the city of Liaoyang, thinking they'd successfully escaped. Weiwei, however, couldn't scrape together enough money for a plane ticket and didn't really have any friends. With no other option, he turned to an ex-girlfriend hoping to lie low. But after a few days, Weiwei grew violent with the woman and lashed out in a fit of rage. He punched her repeatedly, leaving her with 2 shattered eye sockets, a broken nose, and a swollen lip. Although it's not clear what happened in the interim, Weiwei, presumably kicked out, became desperate enough to call his family, begging them for money to help him escape. Whatever he told them, they decided not to give him any money. This made him even more reckless, and Weiwei went on to confess to another woman he was seeing that he'd been involved in the murders. He told her he had killed a family of 4 and was on the run. To fund his escape, he borrowed enough for a plane ticket back to China, but it was already too late. His previous victim, the ex-girlfriend he had assaulted, had reported him to the police just hours before he was set to leave the country. When authorities interrogated the other woman he'd been seeing, she told them everything. Her testimony exposed Weiwei's location, and he was arrested on August 6, 2003. And although they suspected him of the Matsumoto family murder, all they could charge him for at that point was assault. The Japanese police turned their attention to their next suspect, Wang Liang. They raided the residence that he had shared with Yang Ning in Fukuoka, but by the time they had arrived, it was empty, of course, as the pair had fled to China. However, in his room, they found crucial evidence: clothes that had been worn by the three murderers. DNA traces on these garments for Wang, Yang, and Weiwei, linking them directly to the crime. Escaping the country, however, didn't mean Yang and Wang wouldn't eventually be caught. Back in China, both of them started to buy things they clearly couldn't afford, mostly fueled by the stolen money. This soon caught the attention of locals, and they were reported to the police as potential thieves. This led them briefly to go on the run yet again, but Wang got careless and was caught by Chinese authorities on August 19, 2003, for an unrelated crime. The only issue for Wang was that the Japanese authorities had already spoken to their Chinese counterparts, and the Chinese police were ready to help. Wang must have been aware of this, because once in custody and hoping to get leniency on his sentence, he confessed to his involvement in the murders. His confession eventually led to the arrest of Yang, who was apprehended on August the 28th. The Japanese authorities were notified, and they traveled to China to follow up. Their interrogations confirmed that Weiwei was indeed the third accomplice, so he could be charged. After interrogating Weiwei further, they charged him with multiple offenses including trespassing, robbery, murder, and abandonment of a corpse. Initially, there had been speculation that someone in Japan had hired the three men to commit the murder, especially given that they only stole a small amount of money and left valuable items untouched. However, as the investigation progressed, it became clear that the men had acted on their own. They were driven solely by the desire to murder for money, but lacked the brains to do it properly. Weiwei admitted to the police, quote, "We committed the crime with the intent of robbery. Yang noticed Shinjiro's car one night and assumed they were wealthy. We believed the wife ran a high-end restaurant and their house must have had millions of yen in the bank," unquote. Weiwei pleaded guilty but distanced himself from being the mastermind. He claimed he had participated but wasn't the leader. The true mastermind, according to Weiwei and Wang, was Yang Ning, who was described by the authorities as uncooperative and manipulative throughout the investigation. It was also later brought up that Yang had suggested to Weiwei, before the escape, that they kill Wang so they could keep a bigger share of the money. In July 2004, Yang and Wang were indicted in China, and in January 2005, Yang, as the ringleader, was handed a death sentence. Because Wang had confessed early and cooperated with authorities, he was spared the death penalty, but still faced life imprisonment. During his sentencing, in front of the relatives of the victims who had traveled to China, Wang knelt down in the courtroom and tearfully apologized for the killings, which he had recently just described in graphic detail. The relatives of the Matsumoto family found this spectacle outrageous, arguing that Wang should have faced the same fate as Yang. Aware of the case's high-profile nature and the growing criticism in Japan over crimes committed by Chinese nationals, the Chinese authorities took an unusually transparent approach to the trial. While criminal trials in China are typically closed to the public, in a rare move, they ensured that the relatives of the Matsumoto family and members of the Japanese press had access to the proceedings. Japanese media were allowed to cover the hearings, with key parts of the trial translated into Japanese in real time. The same access was granted during the announcement of the verdict. In the aftermath of the trial coverage, Japan moved forward with its own legal process. On March 23, 2004, Weiwei was officially indicted in Japan at the Fukuoka District Court. From the outset, prosecutors made it clear they were pursuing the death penalty. In fact, some legal scholars argued that the prosecutors had influenced the integrity of the trial by requesting for the most severe punishment available, which could have potentially jeopardized it. But by May 19th of that year, Weiwei was sentenced to death. Weiwei appealed on March 8, 2007, but the Court of Appeals upheld the original verdict, supporting the death sentence. On the 26th of December 2019, Weiwei was executed at the Fukuoka detention house at 40 years old. The fallout from this case didn't stop, however, and stirred tensions that went far beyond the courtroom. The leniency shown to Wang Liang caused outrage. The Matsumoto family's relatives saw it as a betrayal. In their eyes, anyone who helped carry out such a brutal crime should have faced the same punishment. The fact that Wang avoided execution while another accomplice, Wei Wei, was hanged in Japan years later only added to the controversy. The case also exposed deeper diplomatic cracks. In response to growing unease, Japan began reducing the number of visas issued to Chinese students. At the same time, Chinese communities in Japan pushed back, accusing the media of using one horrific case to fuel anti-Chinese sentiment. They pointed out that crimes committed by Chinese nationals in Japan were statistically rare, but this case had become symbolic, twisted into something bigger than itself. What began as a violent robbery for a few $1,000s had spiraled into a geopolitical strain. But beneath the headlines, beyond the courtroom drama, one truth remained. An entire family was erased in one night, mercilessly, senselessly, and no trial, sentence, or apology could ever change that. If you enjoyed my videos, please consider subscribing, liking. Thank you for listening. Until next time.